Hi and welcome to this video on getting started with materials in MakeTile. If you haven't used MakeTile before, I suggest watching the Creating Your First Tile video before watching this. MakeTile uses displacement materials to distort the underlying mesh of tiles and objects to make them look like brick, stone, wood, etc. when you print them out. Most of the MakeTile materials are procedural, which means they're created on the fly by Blender using a node graph like this one, rather than from a photo or other image texture. The advantage of this is that the material designer can expose the parameters of the material in the MakeTile menu, allowing you to change multiple aspects of a texture by tweaking a few numbers. The disadvantage is that these materials can be quite complicated to create. When you first create a tile in MakeTile, it won't appear to have a material on it. To see the material, you need to switch from Blender's default render engine to one of the other two. The easiest way of doing this is to click on the Create Lighting Setup button in the MakeTile menu. This will switch the main viewport to the Cycles render engine, which is Blender's non-real-time renderer, and set a couple of options in the background to make sure everything is lit correctly. Because Cycles is a non-real-time renderer, when you move around the scene, you'll see that it doesn't update instantly, and it looks grainy. However, Cycles has a big advantage over Blender's other render engine, Eevee, in that Cycles supports real-time displacement, or micro-polygon displacement in Blender terms, which allows us to get a fairly accurate preview of what the tile will look like when it's exported for printing. If I switch over to Eevee, you can see that although things are now updating in real time, the material is displaying as a flat texture. Eevee, however, is much quicker to update when we change the settings in our material, so I'll be switching back and forth between the two during this tutorial. The wall and floor tiles in MakeTile have a single material applied to them by default when they're created. You can choose this main material when you create the tile here. Once you've created a tile, you can change what material is applied by coming down here to the Materials slot, selecting the currently applied material, and then choosing another one in the drop-down. By default, the wall tiles only have a material applied to the front and back, and not to the top or ends. If you also want to apply material to the top of the tile, make sure you have the material selected in the Materials panel, and then come down to the Textured Areas panel. Find the area where you want the texture to appear, and click on Assign Material. If you want to add multiple materials to a single tile, then you can create a new material slot by clicking on the plus icon in the Material panel, and then assigning a material to that slot. You then need to choose where you want that material to appear by assigning it to a textured area. The Remove Material button does what you'd expect. Once you have your materials assigned and are happy with how your tile looks, you're going to want to click on the Make 3D button to bake the texture and generate a mesh that you can actually export and print. It's best to switch over to the Eevee render engine before doing this, to make sure that what you're seeing is the final geometry. Depending on the speed of your computer, after a few seconds you should have something like this. You can increase the resolution by increasing the number of subdivisions here. 7 will usually be enough, and anything beyond 8 is probably going to severely slow down your computer. One of Blender's more irritating features is that when it's doing a computationally heavy operation like this, it'll freeze and look like it's crashed. 9 times out of 10 it hasn't, it's just thinking, but the only way of being sure is to leave it to do its thing, sometimes literally for hours. I'm working on a couple of optimizations in the way I generate the tiles that will hopefully mean you don't ever need to go beyond 6 or 7 subdivisions in the future. However, for now, be aware that increasing this beyond 6 or 7 will slow things down a lot. If you need to increase the amount the material projects from the surface after you've made it 3D, then you can increase the displacement strength in the material options. To export a single tile at this point, just go down to the Export section, make sure the number of variants is set to 1, make sure your tile is selected, and then click on Export. If you want to export multiple variants of each tile you have selected, then increase the number of variants here. If you click on Return to Preview, we'll have a quick look at how to change the settings of an existing material, save a modified material, and create a new material from an existing one. If I switch the material on my wall over to the bricks material, you can see in the Material Options panel that we have a huge number of variables we can tweak. Changing any of these numbers will alter the way the material appears. Like the displacement strength parameter, the strength parameter affects how much a texture juts out from the surface. The difference is that this also works in the Cycles material preview. The seed parameter allows you to generate a random variation of a texture every time you enter a new number. In the case of the bricks material, this will slightly alter the surface texture and also change the number and the location of some of the cracks. The rotation, location and scale parameters work pretty much as you'd expect, except in the Blender material world, decreasing the scale of something increases its size, which I've never understood, to be honest with you. The rest of the parameters relate to the bricks themselves. We can increase their width and height, change surface roughness, add more or less cracks, etc. In fact, the bricks, the regular stone blocks, the floor tiles, the cobbles, the sawtooths and the wall top materials are all just variations on this same material. They've just got different settings. This is a good example of just how powerful the idea of procedural materials is. If we want to save the material we've generated, you can just click on Save Material. It will save that material to an external materials library file. Currently this file is in the Add-ons, Assets, Materials folder. So make sure you save a copy of this file before you update the add-on, otherwise you can lose the materials which you have spent time creating. You can also copy a material by clicking the Copy Material button, but be aware that you'll need to assign the duplicated material to your tile to see any changes. The last major feature to cover is the material mapping options. There are several different methods of material mapping supported by MakeTile, all of which have certain advantages and disadvantages, and you'll often need to experiment with the different methods to get the best results. If we look at the bricks material first, then by default, if I create a wall and a floor tile with this material, you'll see that while it's displaying on the wall tile, it's not displaying on the floor tile. By default, this material uses a type of texture mapping that works based on wrapping a texture around a reference vector, which by default in this case corresponds to the world z-axis. That means if I create a corner wall, whatever the base angle, the texture will display correctly. However, it means that there is no texture displayed on the floor tiles. If I switch the reference vector to the y-axis, the texture will appear on the floor and on walls that don't align with the y-axis, but not on walls on the y-axis itself. If I use the x-axis, it will behave similarly. If I go back to using the z-axis as our reference vector and select one of the walls and then rotate it, you'll see that the texture becomes distorted. To correct for this, we can use a non-rotated object as a reference object. The triplanar mapping method projects a texture from the top and from each side, and so it will work where you've only got 90-degree angles. But as you can see, it will create a distortion where you've got a non-90-degree angle on an object. There's also one set of tiles that behave rather strangely. Because of the way they're created, materials applied to the curved wall and curved floor tiles won't display correctly in the material preview mode if you're using triplanar mapping or the wraparound mapping. I'll cover what's going on here in a future video, but for now just be aware that when you're using the curved wall or floor tile types, you'll need to make it 3D to see what the material will look like when it's exported. The object, generated, and UV mapping types are used in specific situations, mainly with the custom image material I'll cover in a future video, so we're going to ignore them for now. That's pretty much everything for the standard MakeTile materials. The best way to get a feel for the materials system in MakeTile is just to have a play around with the various options and see what happens. Okay, I think that's everything. Bye for now.